Module 5 of Course 2373 talks about object-oriented programming in Visual Basic.NET. In this module, we provide you with the information required in order to create an object-oriented application that use many of the new features of Microsoft Visual Basic.NET, such as inheritance, overloading, shared members, and event handling. In this module, you learn how to implement object-oriented programming in Visual Basic.NET. We are going to define how to create classes, different steps that you need to take in order to be able to create object-oriented design. Also, we talk about how to create and destroy objects. The second section of this chapter talks about inheritance, interfaces, and teaches you how to work with multiple classes. Let's first talk about how to define classes. In the next few slides, I'd like to take you through some steps in order to be able to create your classes for the first time. Also, in order to be able to share your classes, there are different access modifiers that you have to be familiar with, whether or not you want to share your class only within your assembly or perhaps share it among all available assemblies into your environment, or you can perhaps make it protected in which only the derived classes can perhaps get the information from your class, or different options that are going to be discussed part of the access modifier section. Also, I'd like to talk about how to declare methods in which are giving you the capability in order to define some actions for your classes. Also, I'd like to talk about properties in which allowing you to set some attributes for the objects that you are going to create. And finally, we talk about how to inherit some of the methods from other classes and perhaps change some of the functionalities on them by overloading those methods. Sometimes you want to set some settings before you create your class, so you need to initialize those variables before you get even started with setting the properties and calling the methods of that class. We use constructors in order to set some values before the class gets created. So constructors are being called before the class gets created, and we can have as many as constructors as available. Now, perhaps you ask, okay, if I have more than one constructors, which all of them are going to be executed, or which one is going to be executed first? Well, the answer to that question is only one constructor can be called. But who will define that? A developer who is creating an instance of your class will make a decision about what constructor to call. So for the same reason, if you have more than one constructor, you might be able to have more than one destructors. Therefore, destructor, if it's appropriate, you can clean up the environment for you. So the steps that you need to take in order to define your class for the first time consists of 6 different steps. The first step here is to add a class to your project. Then you provide an appropriate name for the class, usually should be intuitive name, and then you create a constructor as needed, and perhaps a destructor if appropriate, and finally declare properties, methods, and events. Well, the case in which you are going to share your class depends on the access modifier. If you choose public keyword in front of your class or sub-procedure or perhaps functions or even property, you can access those specific items from everywhere. In other words, public keyword make your class to be accessible from every single place within your assembly or outside of your assembly. Private only makes it accessible within the type itself, and then you have friends keyword, which makes it accessible within the type itself and all namespaces and code within the same assembly. Then you have protected, which only being used for inheritance capabilities. And in other words, you can make a base class to be protected, and you can use all the functionalities of that class within the same class, or all the children can also take advantage of it. You could also combine these keywords together, like protected friend, which is a union of protected and friend keyword. There are some examples that I'd like to get you through. Like, for example, in this scenario, they show you how to declare a method. You could specify an access modifier, and then using keyword sub, and then the name of this sub procedure, and then finally you pass your parameters, as many as you want. So for this function, basically the syntax is the same as Visual Basic 6.0. The only difference here is how to declare a property is a little bit different from the type that you had in Visual Basic 6.0. If you used to design application in VB6, well, you have to specify the access modifier, the property keyword, the name of the property, and then the type. Automatically, Visual Basic .NET will give you two different blocks, one for get, one for set. Obviously, get returns the local variable value, and then set will set the local variables. So basically, that way you can set and get the data accordingly. Now, sometimes you can make your property to be read-only or write-only. You can specify the read-only keyword, but for that you cannot have set anymore. You can have only get block, and then for write-only you can only have set block. You cannot have, get block anymore. For either case, or even having both get and set, you can use the default keyword at the beginning of the access modifier. Before the access modifier, if you specify the default keyword, you can make that property to be default for that object. Now, let's talk about attributes. Attributes provide extra information about your code. Like as you see in this small little example, you can specify that this specific sub-procedure called M1 is obsolete. Well, basically that is acting like a self-commentary application. In other words, the application itself identifies that this module should not be used anymore. Well, it's not necessarily for commenting. You can use it for a variety of other purposes like assembly versionizing, web services, component security, and custom format. You need to take .NET framework classes like 2415 in order to be familiar with attributes as a whole. But here we are just discussing it because sometimes we are using it. Just in case if you're going to use the attribute, you have to enclose it within the brackets. And as you see here, that's an example of that. Just consider that all attributes are simply classes that inherit from the attribute class and provide constructors. The obsolete class provides a single constructor that takes a string as parameter, and here we're passing that string into it. Loading methods. Methods with the same name can accept different parameters by using the overloading technique. In this example, as you see, you could have public function display. You pass one parameters as type a string, and then you have the same function name with a different type as an integer. This is valid, and we call them overloading. You could also use the overloading keyword. So overloading is a powerful object-oriented feature that allows multiple methods to have the same name but accept different parameters. For overloading to occur, the method signature must be unique, as you see in this example. So the overloads keyword is optional unless overloading inherited methods. In other words, you can't just not put overloads here unless you're inheriting it from another class. Just as a note, if the option strict compiler option is on, you must explicitly declare values as specific types when passing them to the overloaded method as parameters, and the compiler can identify which instances of a method to call. If option strict is off and a generic value such as like object is passed as a parameter, the decision of which instance of a method to call is left until the runtime. So I would recommend that you should read the procedure overloading in Visual Studio.NET documentation. Now, sometimes you can define or set up some values before the class gets created. You can do that within a constructor. By default, you're getting a specific constructor to call it new. So as you see, public sub new, it would be the default constructor for you. Constructor's new keyword replaces the class underscore initialize in Visual Basic 6.0, and it executes code when object is instantiated. You can overload but does not use the overload keyword. In this example, as you see, I have two different constructors. The one at the top uses the simple format, and the one at the bottom actually uses a parameter into the constructor. So you could have as many as constructors as you want, and basically by the time you're using it, you can make a decision which method you would like to use for your constructor. Destructors also cleaning up the operations. Just in case if you have a constructor, if it's appropriate, you might want to go and design your own destructor for it, which is basically replacing the class underscore terminate. The sub finalize will act like a destructor. Again, you could basically call this a specific destructor in here and cleaning up the operation. Usually the non-memory related variables, like perhaps the connectivity to the database, might be a good choice in order to be set at the finalize. In this example, you are disconnecting from the database perhaps, because it's not necessarily memory related. So you could use this in order to clean up resources and also the code executed when destroyed by the garbage collection. In Visual Basic.NET, when you set an object reference to nothing, you still release variables. However, the object may not be destroyed until the later stage due to the introduction to garbage collection that you perhaps read more about it and learn more about it in course 2415. Now let's talk about the creation and destroying of objects. In the next few slides, I'd like to talk about instantiation and initialization objects, talk a little bit about garbage collection, but as I mentioned in the past, 2415 is a detailed explanation about garbage collection environment, and then we talk about the dispose method. Let's take a look at the sample codes in here, and then we understand how instantiation and initialization occurs. You declare the specific variable, like in this scenario you declare C1 as test class, and then you are creating an instance of that specific class. If you declare a variable but not create an instance, you're not basically instantiating it yet. As soon as you say a new keyword, automatically you're calling the constructor. In this example, the way that you're instantiating it, you're putting it in the same line. So you could say dim C2 as test class equal to new test class. So as you see, both technique will do the same thing, but in this scenario you're instantiating and declaring at the same time, and you're using the default constructor for that. In this example, you're basically using the same technique, but however you are just basically declaring, instantiating and initializing using the default constructor. So the second and the third basically do the same thing. The last one uses not necessarily the default constructor, uses an alternative constructor. This is valid only and only if you have already created more than one constructor, so keep that in mind. As far as the garbage collection, you have to consider that in previous version of Visual Basic, object destruction was based on reference count. References are removed when you set the object to nothing. Now here, the garbage collection basically is going to occur anytime you're setting the your variable to nothing. However, it's not going to be a guaranteed time, because it would not happen at the same time that you want. It will happen eventually. Anytime you really need to reclaim the memory, then that will happen. Now also the garbage collection will call the destructor of object if basically no guarantee of when this will happen. Again, if you want to do it right away, you have two choices: either cleaning it up yourself, or basically force the garbage collection to occur. That basically that would be by creating an instance of a garbage collector and then call the collect method of it, as you see on page 20 on your book. In regard to the dispose method, that would be an alternative way in order to manually cleaning it up, because finalize will call by garbage collection. So you can call public sub dispose and then cleaning up your operation yourself. Now, in this scenario, as you see, the client code will call the dispose method of the class and cleaning up the environment. I have a demonstration in which allows you to create classes, and basically by going through that demonstration, you learn how to just basically put all these theory into an action. After that, you have a lab in which you're going to create the customer class, and that perhaps takes you about 45 minutes to be finished, and then finally I go on to the next section of this course.